Welcome to the Professional Diploma in Web Development. If you've always had a keen interest in full-stack web development, then you've come to the right place. This course has been designed for both beginners as well as experienced web developers who seek a practical approach to web development. In this course, we learn all the fundamentals of web development and learn to code from scratch. We'll begin by installing and exploring our scripting environment, after which we'll move on to programming languages of the web. Now, this includes HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and even PHP. We'll cover both front-end and back-end technology stacks. Throughout the course, we'll develop a bunch of interactive web applications that you can add to your profile to strengthen your credibility as a full-stack web developer. From responsive e-commerce applications, style booking systems, and even HR systems, rest assured that this will be a hands-on course. As a bonus, you will also learn all about SQL databases and how to integrate them into your website. In this lesson, we will discuss the Css Box Model and learn all about how we can use padding, margin, and even borders to style our elements. This will greatly improve the layout and dimensions of all our elements. We'll also learn all about positioning our elements in a styled viewport while working with animations. To wrap things up, we'll put everything we've learned so far into practice. Now, in our previous session, we had a somewhat introduction to CSS. In today's lesson, lesson 7, we are going to be focusing on more advanced concepts in CSS. Now, let's have a look at what's coming up in today's lesson. So in today's lesson, the first thing we'll have a look at is styling the navigation bar. And for the most part, this is going to be a theoretical approach. Now, we've built a navigation system inside of various of the websites that we've sort of worked with. But the idea here is to show you how to style it to make it look like a more modern navigation system. Okay, apart from this, we'll also have a look at the Css Box Model, which is important to understand when it comes to things such as padding, margins, and borders when working with elements. After this, we'll continue with positioning in CSS, and positioning is quite powerful when it comes to placing certain elements in certain sections or parts of your website. And then lastly, we'll have a look at animations in CSS, which is going to be quite exciting because animations really allow your websites to pop and sort of enforces visual cues to your end user. Excellent. Now, before we even jump into the content today, let's have a look at the tip of the day. And the tip of the day is that as web developers, especially as beginners, we need to avoid using templates for the web development process. And this is key, especially when you are a beginner, because it's all good and well to use a template, but remember, a template is built by someone else. So it's best to understand the code from scratch before actually implementing any sort of template to expedite the web development process. And here we go. Our first topic today is styling the navigation bar. And again, this section is going to be mostly theoretical until we eventually get to the part where we have some practical content in styling the navigation bar. Now, the first key aspect in formatting or styling a navigation bar is that we need to be able to format our lists. And by default, if you remember correctly, the UL element or unordered lists are displayed with a solid disk, while ordered lists on the other hand are displayed using numerals, and this includes things like Roman numerals or just numerals such as 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, basic integers. So to alter this, if we want to style our navigation bar by removing the disk, we have to call the list style type property. Okay, that's extremely important. Now, here is a typical example of how we can use images to style our navigation bar or even just format our lists. And essentially, instead of using the predefined list markers, like our disks, for example, software developers or web developers can also opt for graphics. And this includes things like images, icons, as well as GIFs. Okay, and here is a typical example of what that code would look like. We have this unordered list, and we have this list style image property where we reference the URL of the image that we would like to include as part of our replacement for the disk, and this is what the output would look like. So instead of having those solid black disks, we have these purple squares next to our list items. Wonderful. So while all the emphasis on styling the navigation bar, and why is it so important? Well, we've reiterated this a couple of times, but a navigation bar is one of the key elements inside any sort of website, and the same applies to even mobile applications. A navigation bar needs an HTML base which is transformed with CSS. And remember, our navigation system allows us to traverse a website through every single web page included inside of a website. Now, here are additional things we must consider when styling our navigation bar. First of all, a navigation bar is basically a styled unordered list accompanied by list items. Now, if you remember correctly, we house our list items inside of an unordered list or even an ordered list, if that is the case. So to remove the list markers, those disks that we were referring to earlier, we can simply call the list style type attribute or property again, and then set that equal to none, and that will essentially just remove any graphics or remove any predefined or default disk types that is associated with an unordered list. Next, we can also use the display inline property, and this aligns the items horizontally. Okay, and I will be showing you an example of this very shortly. And then to create a vertical navigation bar, we can use the display block. Now, there's this thing between inline and block display elements, and this is extremely important to understand as we progress through web development. And later on in the session, I will be covering the difference between inline and block level elements. Also, to space list items, we use padding, margin, and even borders sometimes as properties. And again, this is something we will be covering in this session. With that being said, here we have an example of how we can actually style our navigation bar. We can either do it horizontally, which is what we would consider the most adoptable or the most adopted approach among web developers, okay, where you would have all your list items in a horizontal fashion or placed next to each other, okay. And then we also have the vertical approach where we can have a sidebar or a hamburger menu, if you will, okay, where each of the list items are preceded or they are placed in sequence, one below the next. Okay, so these are the two typical approaches you would take when it comes to designing your navigation bar. Now, very important, this is not to say that this is the only approach, but keep in mind we want to sort of follow best practice. So let's have a look at some of the list style properties that we can use when it comes to styling our navigation bar or just a list. And the first one we have is the list style property. And this is essentially the shorthand for manipulating all the properties associated with styling a list. Okay, and this includes the position, the type, the image, and all of those things. You don't always use the shorthand unless you want to sort of cram your code and condense your code. Okay, we also have the list style position, and this specifies where to place the list item marker. Next, we have the list style image, and this is something we went over. And here we can reference any graphic that we want to include as opposed to using the default solid disk. Okay, and then lastly, we have list style type, and this specifies the type of list item marker associated with a list or a navigation bar. Now, I did also mention that we have two different kinds of elements. Firstly, we have block level elements, and then we also have inline level elements. But let's dive a little deeper and unpack the two to distinguish the difference between each of them. Now, when it comes to block level elements, there are some overlapping characteristics with inline level elements. So the first characteristic here is that they can appear in the body of an HTML page. They can actually appear anywhere in the HTML document, but in most cases you tend to use them within the main body, the main content of your web page or your HTML page. And then it can also contain block level elements as well as inline level elements. So when you use a block level element, you can accompany both inline and block level elements inside of a single block level element. Apart from this, block level elements begin on a new line, and I would say this is probably one of the biggest differences between the two. So block level elements by default do not appear on the same line when you create two of them together. Okay, so think of it like this: if you have a breaking point between the two, they would shift one below the other. And then lastly, block level elements create larger structures, and this includes things such as images and massive elements on a website, for example. And what we have here is a typical example of what a block level element in the code and the output would look like. In our code over here, we've got these two div elements. Okay, in the one div element, we've got this text that says hello. In our second one, we've got this one that says world. And then just below that, we've got a paragraph tag that says the div element is a block level element and will start on a new line. So let's have a look at what the output would look like for something like this. And what our output looks like here is that we've got hello world, and we've got hello, and then we've got world. And like you said, with block level elements, they appear in a sequential fashion. So one would be below the other. Okay, they do not appear on the same line. And then our paragraph tag is also a block level element, believe it or not, because this also appears on a separate line. So then what about inline elements and how do they differ? While when it comes to inline elements, they can, much like a block level element, appear anywhere in the HTML document, but we tend to again use them mostly inside the body of our web page, well, HTML page. Okay, and they can contain data about other inline elements as well. This is something I will show you in an example just to give it a bit of concrete understanding as to how we can actually contain data inside of inline elements. And then apart from this, inline elements do not begin on a new line. Okay, this is one of the key factors again, and one of the differences between inline and block level elements. Inline elements always appear on the same line as its preceding element. And then lastly, inline elements create shorter structures, and this could be things like span tags. Okay, now let's have a look at what an inline element would look like when we actually use it inside of our code and our website. So here we have a typical example of what an inline element looks like inside of our code. And essentially what we are working with here is we've got this span tag. We've got one span tag at the top, also pretty much similar to the previous example, which is hello. And then we've got another span tag that says world, and then just below that we've got a paragraph tag. Now this is what the output looks like for that. So instead of having hello world on two separate lines, we have them in a single line. Okay, therefore we consider our span tags inline elements. However, our paragraph is still a block level element, and that's why it will always appear on a new line. Wonderful. Now to better understand padding, margins and borders, let's have a look at the CSS box model. So what exactly is this box model in CSS? Well, essentially the box model is an invisible layer that's embedded around every single HTML element, okay? And it consists of various layers. And when I say every HTML element, I mean every single one of them. And this includes paragraph tags, div containers, images, for example. And here is a visual representation of what the box model looks like. We've got the content in the center. Beyond that, we've got the padding. Just beyond the padding, we've got the border, and then our last layer consists of the margin. So in essence, just to summarize, we've got the padding, we've got the borders, we've got the margins, and then we've also got the content, the actual HTML element that we want to manipulate. So when it comes to padding, borders, margins, and content, essentially this is how we can break it down, starting with the content. The content is the actual HTML element that we want to manipulate, or the layers that we want to manipulate around a specific HTML element. And this includes, again, your div tags, your images, your paragraph tags, all of these elements that are visually visible to the user. Okay, and then beyond the content, we have our padding, and the padding is a clear area around the content. So essentially it's transparent and visible, and it extends from the content to the border layer. So the padding sits between the content and the border. Now the border is the next layer in our box model, and a border surrounds the padding, spacing, as well as the content. So in essence, your border houses your content as well as your padding. Now the border is not necessarily transparent. It could be, but in most cases you would visually style your border to sort of signify to the user that this is a border that surrounds any sort of content. And then lastly, we have our margins. Now a margin clears an outside area beyond the border, much like our padding, but sits beyond the border instead of inside of the border. Okay, and we can use margins to space content or multiple elements. So if you have two paragraph tags and you want to space them out, you can actually use a margin setting where you could manipulate the margin to space that content accordingly. So to better understand all of this, let's have a look at some code snippets and output and what it would actually look like if we manipulate these layers. So first of all, we have our padding. Now here we've got an HTML document, and then we've got our CSS code associated with that. Okay, now this is just a snippet outside of the entire document. And then this is what the output would look like. Now it looks very, very basic, but what I want you to take note of here is that in our HTML code, we have a div container called a container2. And then we are manipulating that container in our CSS code by adding padding of 30 pixels, and this is what the output gives us. It gives us 30 pixels from the element on the inside in either direction, top, bottom, left, and right. So in either direction from the element inside of our div container, we are adding 30 pixels. And again, you'll notice here that this is sort of an invisible layer. Okay, now we also added a background color of cornflower blue just to make it visible to the user. Next up, we have borders. Now, in this example, you'll see there's actually more of a visual representation of our borders. We've got our HTML code, we've got our CSS code, and they are exactly the same as the previous slide, okay? The only difference here is that we are now adding a border style of solid in our CSS code, and we're adding a border width of 20 pixels, and this is what our output looks like. So again, you'll notice there is still that padding of 30 pixels being added, but beyond that padding, there is this black border of 20 pixels, okay? So therefore, our border sits outside of our padding, and our padding sits between the border and the actual content. And now lastly, we have margins. And in our code here, things are slightly different. We've also added a paragraph element with an ID of text2, and this reads, this is text2 outside the div container. So this is a separate element from the container we've been working with. We've also given this text2 element a background color of coral and a padding of 30 pixels. And we can see that in our output over here. We can note by seeing that the background color coral is being pushed out from the text. Okay, so there's a bit of spacing involved for our text2 element. And then what I really want you to take note of here is that we've also added a margin of 80 pixels to the div container we were referring to earlier. And what you'll see here is that the margin affects all the content beyond the border of the div container. Okay, so we can use margin to space elements beyond the border. We can use padding to space the content inside of the div container and between the border. Now, in the event that you want to learn more about borders, margins, as well as padding, you can check it out at w3schools.com by simply running a search on the CSS Box Model. And we have these links on the side over here that will give you an idea of the properties that you can manipulate. So you don't always have to have a border right around an element. You could even just have it on the left side of an element, for example. Okay, apart from this, there's some properties that you could manipulate with a margin. So you could just do a margin at the top, the right, the bottom, the left, and so on. There's just so much information available to you on W3 Schools, and it's packed with web development content as well. And even if you want to have a look at padding parameters and properties, you can check that out as well. So I do strongly suggest doing a bit of research or additional research on the CSS Box Model, because it's going to equip you and prepare you for the more complex things that we do later on in this course. Wonderful. Now I hope W3 Schools serves you really well as a resource, as it has for me. Moving on to our next topic, positioning in CSS. Now, when it comes to positioning in CSS, it works slightly different from padding, margins, and borders. And essentially, the positioning property specifies the type of positioning method used for any given element. So elements are positioned using the top, bottom, left, and right values. We must specify these values when we position any items or use the positioning property. However, these values will not work unless the positioning property is set before directional parameters. Now, much like we have different layers in the CSS box model, we also have different types of approaches or types of positioning. And the first one is static. And static is the default parameter or the default property when it comes to HTML elements. Okay, so the key thing we must note here is that if we specify a positioning type of static, we cannot affect the bottom, top, left, and the right properties of that element's position. Okay, it's always going to be fixed in one location. This is different from fixed, and it's different from sticky positioning. Next, we have relative, and relative is basically position relative to its normal position. So if we wanted to offset an element from its original position, which would be static, and we wanted to offset it by, say, 20 pixels or 10% or 20%, we can do so using the relative type or the relative approach. Next, we have fixed, and fixed position is relative to the viewport, which means it always stays in the same place even if the page is scrolled. Okay, and the difference here between fixed and static again is we can actually place an element in the center of the screen, and no matter how much we scroll, that element is always going to stay fixed in that viewport or in that specific part of the viewport. Okay, typical example that you would see in the real world is things like forms in the bottom corner of a website. And then next we have the sticky position type. Now when it comes to this particular type, it lends itself to the fixed positioning as well as relative and static, if you will. And when it comes to sticky, it's exactly that. The user's element will scroll accordingly, but when the user runs out of real estate in the viewport, the element sort of sits itself and remains static in one position. Okay, this is best shown in an actual example. And then lastly, we have absolute. Now, absolute items are positioned relative to the nearest position ancestor or parent element. We tend to use absolute if we have a relative container like a div container and want to add something inside of that container that has a position type of absolute. Again, all of these really make a lot more sense when we actually do a practical and I show you a demonstration. Now let's turn our attention to a couple of examples, starting with the static positioning. And remember, this is the default positioning for any element that you create in HTML. And this is what the output looks like. Now in our HTML code over here, we are doing internal styling. Now keep in mind, just for the sake of these examples, we'll be using internal styling. In future, we always opt for external styling. So we have a div with a class of static. We reference that div in our CSS code and we give it a position type of static. You'll note here that we are not specifying bottom, left, right, and top, because with the static positioning type, we do not need to do this. Now next up, we have relative positioning, and for the most part, the code remains the same. The only difference is, in our HTML code at least, we've given the div a class name of relative, okay, and this is what the output looks like. Now you'll note that in our CSS code at the very top, we've given it a position of relative, and just below that line of code, we've set the left parameter by 30 pixels. So if you look at our output, we've offset this div element by 30 pixels to the left. So it's been shifted over slightly to the right hand side. And next up, we have fixed positioning. Now, fixed positioning works very differently from the previous two in that when we create an element, the element remains fixed in the position that we initially position it in, which is different from static position. Okay, and this is what the code looks like for working with fixed positions. And essentially, we have a div tag, and we've changed the class name once again to fixed, and then this is what the output looks like. Okay, now there's not much to go on here, so I do have a slight demonstration of how fixed works in the next slide. What you'll notice here is that we call fixed in our position when we specify that property, and then we give it a bottom parameter of 50%, and then we set the right attribute to 0. Okay, now here what we have is the behavior of our fixed position works. What you'll see is our little element that we have on our right hand side of the screen. That element remains in that position no matter how much the user scrolls inside of the web browser or the client. And this is why we use fixed, because we want to make sure that the UI elements that we create remains within the user's view. Now, similar to the fixed positioning, we also have sticky, but sticky behaves slightly differently. Now, what I want you to take note of here is that we've got the exact same code, and like before, this is our output, and we've essentially again just changed the class name to sticky. We reference it at the top in our CSS code, and we basically say that the position property we set to sticky, we set the top to 0, the padding to 5 pixels, and the background color and the border and all of those things we set as standard. But this is what the behavior looks like. You'll notice that when the user scrolls down and the element hits the top of the client or the web browser or just the interface or the viewport, it basically remains there. And when the user scrolls back up, it sort of offsets back to its original position. And this is the difference between sticky and fixed. We tend to use the sticky approach when we want to implement it with a navigation bar, for example. And then lastly, we have absolute positioning. Now take note of the CSS code and the HTML code. Starting with the HTML code, we have two div containers right at the very bottom. First of all, the first div container has a class name of relative. And then what you'll notice is that inside of that div container, we have another container and we've given it a class name of absolute. And this is what the output would essentially look like for something like that. Now, what's the difference here? The difference here is that when we place an absolute element inside of a relative element, like the div elements we have over here, we treat the relative element as our new viewport. The client no longer is our viewport, okay? And this is what the code looks like. We set the first div to relative, and then we set the second div to absolute. So the div that's been treated as absolute, or that has an association with absolute as a position property, treats the relative div as its new viewport or its ancestor, or also known as the parent element. Wonderful. Now, just as a bonus, I've also added Css Float, which is sort of considered positioning, but it's not really positioning in terms of properties. So the Css Float property specifies how an element should float and is used to position elements such as images or containers within the whole of the viewport or the client. Okay, and here are a couple of properties that you can use with Css Float. So you would either align left, right, inherit, or using none, which is the default. Okay, So when we use the float property, we would take that element and float it to the most left of the screen or float it to the most right of the screen, depending on the property value that we would choose. Okay, if we go with inherit, it's going to borrow the properties from its parent container. This could be a paragraph tag inside of a div container. Now I do have an example that I actually want to show you over here. And this is essentially what that example looks like for our HTML code and our CSS code. Now first, I want you to take note of our HTML code. We've got 3 elements that we are working with here inside the body. We've got one paragraph tag, we've got a second paragraph tag, and then we also have an image element that we are working with. Now, this is what the output looks like if we float something to the left. Okay, so essentially what we're doing is we are sort of creating an inline standard here where the image would have been below or above the paragraph tag. We've decided here we want to align it next to the paragraph tag. Okay, and then you'll notice in our CSS code we are then calling the image just by the image attribute, and then we're saying float this image to the left of all the content that surrounds it. Pretty straightforward, right? But can be very, very useful. Now, before we wrap up the session, let's have a look at what's coming up in our final lesson of Module 1. In our next lesson, we'll be gearing towards bringing everything together. This includes everything we've learned in HTML, including CSS, and preparing ourselves for a major project. In this project, we'll design a very basic single-page application of a grocery store where you can order your food online. This includes things such as animations, transitions, positioning, and all the things that we've learned so far in advanced and introductory CSS. So I really hope to see you there, because this is going to bring everything together and wrap this module up really, really nicely. Excellent. Now for our last topic in lesson 7 today, we are going to be working with animations in CSS. And this really gives our website a little more pop than what we are used to. So how do we work with animations in CSS? You might think it's complex, but it really is not. So animations are essentially dynamic changes of most HTML elements inside of our website, and we can achieve this without using JavaScript. In future though, when we get to module 4, we will be using JavaScript to implement this. So an animation lets an element gradually change from one style or even a state to another. To use CSS animations, you must first specify the keyframes keyword for the animation. Keyframes hold what styles the element will have at certain points in time as an animation transitions. Now, much like all other facets of HTML elements we've been working with, animations also come with properties. And the first one that we should always ensure that we use when we create animations is the animation name. And this specifies the name of the animation that we want to manipulate using keyframes. Okay. Apart from this, we should also set the animation duration, and usually we do this in seconds. We can also delay an animation with the animation delay property in the event that we want to give the animation a bit of time before it actually starts or initializes. And then we can also loop through an animation to ensure that an animation plays a certain amount of times by using the animation iteration count. We can also set the direction of the animation, and we can also use the animation fill mode, which specifies the value applied by the animation outside the time that it is executing. Okay, and then lastly, we can either pause or play an animation given any state. Now let's have a look at a couple of examples of animations in CSS. First of all, here we have an example of animating colors and borders. Okay, and in our HTML code, we simply have a div container with an ID of square. In our CSS code, we have the square that we're referencing. Then we've got this thing called @WebKit keyframes square anim. We do not need to worry about this for the time being. What I want you to take note of is the first block in our CSS code and the last block. Okay, and this is what our output looks like. Now let's work through this together. In the first instance, we notice that the block starts with a certain color. Okay, that color being red. So we specify the square and all the parameters of the square itself, and we add that on our CSS code, where we give it a width of 100 pixels, a height of 100 pixels, and then we provide it with an animation name, which is square-anim, and then the duration of that animation is 4 seconds. And that all happens in this first block of code. Now, the most important part over here. After we've given our animation a name, we then specify how we want that animation to roll out. And what's happening is, at 0% of the 4 seconds, which is the first second of the animation, the background color is red of the square and the radio is 0 pixels. So we get these sharp edges. At 25% of that 4 seconds, we have a background color of yellow and a radius of 20 pixels, and so on. With 50%, exactly the same thing happens, where we change the color and the radius. And then lastly, at 100%, we see that the square goes from blue to green with a radius of 60 pixels. So essentially what's happening here is that through every percentage of our animation, the animation holds a specific state. In this case, the color changes as well as the border state. Okay, now that can be a bit tricky, so let's have a look at another example. Now in our next example over here, we are working with the size of our element. Again, we've got a square, right? We've got a div container with the ID of square too, where we've specified our CSS code at the top, and this is what our output looks like. The animation is going to grow in different sizes as well as colors. So the initial state is whatever we specified when we called the square2 object, okay, with the width of 100 pixels, the height of 100 pixels, the duration of the animation, and this animation's name is squareAnim2, okay, and it only iterates every 3 times, so the animation only runs 3 times. But since this is a GIF, it's going to keep looping and keep looping. If we move down to our keyframes attribute that we're calling, or the property that we're calling, we notice here that at 0% it holds a specific state, at 25% another state, until we get to 100, which is the last state before the animation essentially resets. Now let's have a look at one more example when it comes to animation. Now in this example, we are animating the position of the div container. Here we have another div container with an ID of square3, and the same holds true. We've named the animation, we've given it initial parameters, and this is what the output looks like. The animation is shifting, or the square itself is shifting to different positions, and we can tell because we've given the square. If we look in our HTML or our CSS first block, we have a position of relative. Okay, now we're also changing the background color. This is not something I want you to be concerned with though. What I really want you to take note of is that here we provided it with a position of relative, so we can offset it multiple times in our animation. So at 0%, we have a position of left at 12.5%. Then we move to 25%, we have it left at 25%. At 50%, we have it left at 37.5%. And then finally, at the last frame of this animation, we have it sitting at 50%. Now, I know many of you might be feeling like this, where you are just overwhelmed with all of the code that we went through today. But I want to reassure you, if you attend our next session in lesson 8, all of this is going to make sense, because believe me, when it comes to web development or any programming language, the best way to learn is to practice, practice, practice until it becomes second nature to you. I'll see you in the next lesson. Cheers.